good to see you guys here. Kentucky Bluebirds, Tommy Coyote, Cotton Star, good to see you as well. Cotton Star says forensic question document and forensic linguistics is comparable to a fingerprint. It's that significant. Yeah, a lot of people think that some people call it graphology, some call it handwriting analysis. Some people think of it as the pseudoscience of true crime. And it certainly can be. I think it is as pseudoscientific as the person who is doing the analysis. So I think the same applies to a lie detector. Can also be useless in certain people's hands, but it can also be very valuable. I believe it's usually a very valuable tool, but it's got to be handled right. You guys can decide as we go through this whether you think my analysis is worth a damn. I've spent quite a lot of time collating all the information. To be honest, the reason I'm doing a live is because it would take a phenomenally large amount of time to sync everything I'm going to say to the letter. And that's essentially what one does need to do. So if you can, try and have the 8-page statement to hand, but you can always refresh yourself by just looking at whatever is online. I put up my previous video, basically provides all the pages. So if you need to refer to those sources, I'm going to provide a little bit of other material. I'll provide that in links. So if you on your desktop, you'll be able to look at it. One of them is this particular article. It is from the Daily Mail. It is dated 4th of October 2021, and it deals with Gabby and Brian both getting tattoos, and when they had these tattoos done, they both signed documents and filled in documents. And so we're going to use this as their baseline. We're going to use these documents as their baseline. This is the one for Brian Laundrie. So I'll just put a link to that particular image. And this is the one for Gabby Petito. Now, you don't absolutely have to refer to what I'm providing here. You can also just listen to what I'm saying. And if you feel like you don't either believe me or you feel like you'd like to see for yourself, that's when you need to refer to these documents. Terry says, hooray, Nick read my mind, was hoping for this analysis. Sagedi Norna, dang, I accidentally hit the yes. My vote should be no. Okay. Cotton Stair says, by the way, Amanda Knox did write that note. Which note is that? Amy Hall says, hi, everyone. Cotton Star says, at Christmas time, when you go to your mailbox and retrieve the 10 to 15 colored envelopes, how do you know which one is from your mom? Good point. Okay, so here we go. So if you haven't voted in the poll, make sure that you do. It's a very interesting question. I'm not going to give my take on it until a little bit later. But the question is, can you change yourself? Can you change who you are by changing your handwriting? So far, 86% have said no, 15% have said yes. Okay. So we'll address that in a little bit more detail. I want you to think about that as we go through this, as we make note of idiosyncrasies with Brian's handwriting. Think about, could he have changed? If you could have, let's say Brian was captured and you had the letter and you sat with him in prison and you said, let's do this note over, just for argument's sake. And let's fix this note and improve it. Do you think that can change who Brian is? It might sound like a silly, ridiculous question, but you'll see it's actually got some merit. Okay, so Now we're going to go into 7 insights from the Laundrie confession note. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to start off this analysis by referring to neutral text, so text that doesn't form part of the retrieved confession note, just to kind of establish the beginnings of a baseline. And so, as I said earlier, this is a sample of Brian Laundrie's handwriting from October 2020 when he and Gabby applied to get tattoos. So this is a little bit important to look at if you can. I'll provide a link for the article, but more specifically, you guys need to look at this particular image, which is the release form, the document that Brian filled in order to get the tattoo done. Julie says, keeping us on our toes in 3, 2, 1 minutes. Yeah. Thought Criminal says, find you someone who looks at you the way Timmy looks at Nick. Okay, cool. Okay, Cotton Star, send me a link to that note if you can. Gina says, love the live analysis. Okay, so here we go. So when you look at that release form, and those of you who are perhaps on a desktop or an iPad or something, if you open it up, what do you see when you look at that form? This is really where we're testing your ability to pay attention to detail, where we test your observation skills. And to some extent, we sort of bring to the surface your intuition when it comes to handwriting. What do you notice when you look at that? What do you notice from this release form? I'll give you a clue. Ignore the lines and entries dealing with date of birth, address, home phone, tattoo description, artist signature, and artist name. Exclude all of that. Exclude all of that and just focus on the script in the top line where it says name and the client signature. So that's really just 2 lines, right? What do you notice? Do you notice anything? Let's have a look at what you guys say. Lisa Stokes, hi, greetings from Colorado. Thanks for joining us, Lisa. Darkness Exposed, good to see you. Susan Bennett, hi from Washington State. Thought Criminal is thinking. So I'll put a link to that image in chat again, in case you missed it. And obviously I'm making this a lot easier for you. Don't look at any of the lines except the line stating name and the line stating client signature. And then the question is, what do you infer from that? That's the question. What do you infer from that? Terry says both written by Gabby. That's not the answer, but not a bad guess. Mel Stiller, I'm from Western Canada. Ramblin' Rome, the signature. What about the signature? Jasmine D says shaky, inconsistent writing. In what way? Jay Hughes says both by Gabby. I don't think so. Mary Steelman says printed script. Good one, Tommy. Tommy says can't really read his signature. Thought Criminal says shaky signature. Now we're getting somewhere. Tracy Marie, hi from New Zealand. This will be interesting. I love a learning experience. Cappy Portal, wrote with the wrong hand, maybe. Amy Hall says, I'm on my phone. No, I'm on my iPhone. Amy, you'll just have to take our word for it, okay? So, by the way, this is Gabby's release form. And I must say, it does look a little bit like Brian Laundrie, the name was written by Gabby. It does look a little bit like that. It definitely does look a little bit like that. Okay, so Thought Criminal says Laundrie doesn't look like Laundrie on the signature. Mel Stiller says, sorry, but I missed Nick's question. So the question is, when you look at Brian's release form, and yeah, we're talking about getting a baseline for his handwriting. The question is, what do you see? And so as I say, how about his signature? Now, we're assuming that's Brian's signature. I think there is definitely the possibility that Gabby signed it and kind of made a mess, especially if Gabby did write his name there. But one also wonders, if Brian was there because he got the tattoo, why would he not sign? Of course, young people do funny things all the time. But if we do assume that it's Brian's signature, it looks weak, it looks unpracticed, it looks small, and it's incomplete. It's missing dots on the eyes on both sides. It's missing a line underneath. Doesn't it look incomplete to you? And whether our thought process on this is accurate or not, we're just trying to get started. We're just trying to kind of get warmed up. So you would think for an artist, Brian Laundrie was an artist, a signature tends to be a big deal. And I can speak quite authoritatively on this. My brother is a full-time artist. My great-grandfather was a master landscape artist. Your signature is a very, very big deal if you're an artist. You practice it, you get it exactly right. It's your trademark. Brian was an artist. That's how he saw himself. And is this really his signature? My aunt and my great uncle are also all artists, so they all had to sort of, get their signature right. My father's got a distinctive signature. I do. I'm sure you do as well. And here, Brian's signature looks like a 10-year-old's. So it could be that Gabby signed for him, but the other possibility is, if this is Brian's signature, you kind of get the feeling that he's really not signed his name very often. What is the squiggle after the N in Brian? And what is the weird jagged peak in front of the A in Laundrie, right? What's that all about? It's just a very clumsy signature. So in the end, Brian got this particular tattoo. And I'll put a link to that if you want to have a look at it. Brian got this tattoo and Gabby got this tattoo. And again, you might say, well, he was quite young. Well, Gabby was even younger. If you ever look at her signature, it's the way you'd expect it. There's a bit of a flourish, right? Amy Hall says, I can't listen to Nick and look at the link. Okay, she says, I don't mind. Okay, so Tommy says Gabby's signature is softer and more consistent. Absolutely. So that is also what a proper signature should look like, right? It has some personality. It has some verve. It's not small or clumsy. It's kind of a statement of intent. It's like, this is me. I am here. There's a bit of a flourish to it, right? And all of that is missing with Brian Laundrie's signature. Now, you might say again, maybe Brian was in the car or whatever, and so Gabby filled in his form for him and signed it for him. Nevertheless, I think the thinking is sound, even if that's the case, is that has Brian found himself? Has he found his signature kind of thing? And there might be another source as well where one can check that or test that. So with that out of the way, let's deal with the 7 insights from the Laundrie confession. And we're going to start off with Gabby's name. Now, this is where I really wish I could share these images with you. I have obviously spent a lot of time preparing this, but for those of you who really want to, if you're on Patreon, this is a handy link. It's the script that I prepared for right now. So you can have a look at that. If you haven't joined Patreon, you might have to do so quickly, or if you're playing this on replay, you can do it that way. Bria Lace, good to see you here. Welcome. Mel Stiller asked the question, a weak signature from a weak man, right? So there's a good sort of opening analogy to the poll question. And the poll question is, can you change yourself by changing your handwriting? So far, 80% are saying no. What if, for example, you start with your signature? And let's say whether you are 10 years old, 20 years old, 30 years old, 50 years old, or 80 years old, you say, for example, well, I want my signature to be more this, that, or the other, right? What do you think that is? It's assessing how you see yourself and to some extent changing it, to some extent editing it, to some extent either improving it or whatever the word is, right? Does that make sense? Angela Gallagher, good to see you here. Bria says, I love Nick's scripts and notes. Okay, so let's get started now. Tell me, what are you doing? Okay, so here we go. So those following the script on Patreon, you can see all 7 references to Gabby's name that Brian uses, right? So I kind of screen grabbed them, zoomed in, and juxtaposed all of them in chronological order. And what is astonishing is the variability. The other thing that is astonishing is I think in the beginning I counted 5. So I sort of read through the whole thing, counted 5, and I was like, there are 5 instances in 8 pages. And as I was sort of doing a bit more work, I was like, oh, actually there's 6. And then I was like, okay, there's 6 instances. But what I'm trying to say is the writing is so murky and muddy and muddled and all over the place, so scratchy. It took quite a long time to figure out, wow, he actually mentions Gabby's name 7 times. And it seems like a lot, but it's 7 times in 8 pages. And if you think about the sort of central 2 or 3 pages are all about Gabby and what happened to her, the fact that her name is almost not mentioned at all is quite strange. So I provided all 7 references in chronological order, going from left to right and top to bottom. Now, as I said, 7 references may seem like a lot. It may even seem sufficient, but it actually averages out at less than a single reference to Gabby per page. So another way of thinking about it is the the confession note, the entire thing is about 773 words. I know because I copied it out onto Word and counted the words. And so that kind of averages Gabby's name once every approximately 100 words, right? It's not a lot, actually not a lot. And then this is where, again, you could do with looking at the confession note. Let me just provide a link to that. If you guys want to have a look at it. Do you guys want to see this? I think one of the best sources is this one. It's from Fox News. There are others, but if you can't see it, it might just be worthwhile going to that link, and you can start by going to this image. So you can start by going to this image. Okay. I don't think I want to provide all of them, but here we go. So if you look at the first instance where, and this is quite important, if you look at the first instance where Brian writes Gabby's name the very first time, it's the very first word, the very first name, the very first instance of Gabby. This is quite important to look at. Her name, do you notice her name fits properly between the first 2 lines? it kind of appears to be written appropriately, right? It is not only the first letter, the second, third, fourth, fifth letter, all of them sort of hold together in an even way, that they all sort of float in a proper way. But then you start to look at that name in context to other letters and other words. Then what you notice is her name fits properly between the first two lines, but then nothing else on the first page does. So her name is like in a straight line, but then everything else is kind of going through lines and going all over the place. If you pay attention to that, you'll really see that. The other thing is Gabby's name is also the biggest word on page 1, right? And he doesn't say dear Gabby or my darling Gabby, or it's just Gabby, right? And bear in mind, Gabby doesn't exist anymore, so it's in a way it's a bit strange. Why is he writing a letter to someone who can't read it? So even the person who he's addressing it to is a bit of an odd thing. So Gabby's name is the biggest word on page 1, and that's where you need to see it in context. As the narrative progresses, as you go through all the other pages, you see how the size and the mentions of her name diminish more and more. So in other words, this first reference to her name is the biggest. I think Gab's on the next page is also quite big, although he never uses a capital letter again. But from then on, it gets smaller and smaller and smaller, where you can almost not read it. It's so small. And isn't that really what happened with her? He saw her in the beginning, fell in love with her. She was Gabby. And then as time went by, somehow she became smaller and smaller and smaller, and eventually didn't actually exist. And maybe that's an analogy for what happened to him. But just taking that one word, and it's an important word because it's her name. It's how he writes her name. He's got control over how he writes her name. He's got control. It's not only that, it's also the mirror in the way that he sees her, right? He sees her in the way he writes her name, that is being expressed, right? So again, you ask the question, can you change yourself by changing your handwriting? So if you had to write something down yourself, and maybe you've got someone in your life that you write their name in a particular way that's perhaps negative, maybe it goes downwards or something, and you say to yourself, I'm going to try and write their name so it goes upwards. That is going to start affecting your psychology. You might say, well, I think that actually shows I have a negative feeling towards this person. Well, once you know that, and if you want to, you can change that feeling. Okay, so you also notice that the undated note is addressed to Gabby, and that the first mention, Timmy, you want to get off? And I think he's getting cold. The first mention of her name looks right. So the very first time Brian writes her name, it actually looks right. It's sort of the right size. It is going in it's kind of aligned. It's proportioned well between the two lines. As I say, all 5 letters are the appropriate size, shape, and they even tilt slightly upwards, right? There's even almost like an optimism in writing her name. And that's when you need to then, you look at that and you totally focus on that, and then you look at what's below that. And so for me, it's difficult to say. I wonder what you guys think. It's difficult to say whether Brian purposefully violated the line spacings on this page. Like, did he purposefully try and write in a very chaotic way, as if to say, can you see this was very hard for me, or can you see that I was troubled? Is he trying, almost because he's an artist, he's trying to show the distress that he was in? And the reason I say this is because page 1 is the only page where the writing literally goes, in some cases, over 4 lines. So in other words, it'll go from a particular point through 4 separate individual blue lines. That's a heck of a lot, especially on a small notepad like this. And in some cases, it kind of even forms like a hill. It sort of goes up and reaches the middle of the page, and then it goes back down again, which is quite crazy. And so one wonders, was this intentional? Was this Brian like really trying hard to show I've been emotionally compromised, I'm really hurt by this, I want you to see my distress? Or was this Brian literally just writing in a non-thinking way? But I mean, it's like you can imagine if there were no lines, if it was a page with absolutely no lines or a card, right? You can imagine him writing that way, but you kind of literally go through the lines. Is like, dude, what is going on with you, kind of thing. Maybe the sun was shining on the page and he couldn't quite see the lines or something, but do you get my point? So I'm just saying, is he trying to pretend to be more distressed than he is, or is he so confused or whatever it is that he's writing all over the place? What do you guys think? Someone made quite an interesting comment here, says, put a note on your knee and then you have the round type of writings too. That's definitely something that I'd considered. It's possible that he did that. And then from then on the next page, he had a harder surface. That is possible. Autumn Renee says, I think it's messed up having pondered okay, I'm not quite sure what you're saying there. Julie says, leaning on his leg to write, maybe in poor light, in high emotional state on top. So yeah, it's important to think about that, but we also need to think about what follows. So as I said, page one, it's not like he just breaks through a line. He dives into new ones. By around midway through page one, Brian's text is tiny. Because of the way it's sort of cascading upwards and going down, he's got to try and sort of fit it in. And so suddenly his text has gone very, very tiny. It's tilted. It's mashed against itself. It's squeezing in some cases through 4 different lines. It's really, the middle part of that page is just kind of a mess. Corporal Deb, thanks a lot. Corporal Deb says, do you think this is Brian Laundrie's real notes and book? Yes, I do. I believe there's kind of a conspiracy that it's not. Tommy says Brian is deceptive and manipulative. Okay, so I think it's also possible that, like, what is the motive of all of this? What is the intent, the purpose of him writing this? And I think it's possible the 8-page note was intended to be actually in the beginning just a one and only page. If we look at the first page, it's addressed to Gabby and he ends off saying, I will always love you. And you can kind of almost imagine he's going to stop there. And one's also got to wonder, did he write this is it Mayakachi Park, or did he write it somewhere else? Where did he write it, kind of thing? I don't know, somehow I think he did, but it is quite interesting to think, was his idea is only going to write 1 page, and then it's like, okay, well, now kill yourself, and it's like, well, I'm not really going to do that right now. Then he's there for a little bit longer, and he decides he'll write a bit more, and then the same thing happens, and how many times does it repeat? So it's also possible the 8-page note was intended to be, I've said that. It's not the only page, but the 8-page note is not the only page that starts and ends on the same page. So obviously if you're intending for something to be the one and only page, it would end on that page, and that was your intent all along. But it's not the only page that starts and ends on the same page. So page 2 also starts and ends, I think, on the same page. Obviously, the last page starts and ends on the last page, and even the page, I think, before that. The middle pages, where he starts to talk about the scenario, pages 3, 4, 5, and 6, all follow on one another. So you can see there he was actually sort of like, okay, I'm going to now tell the story, right? But the question is also, was he always going to tell that story? Was he always going to say, okay, guys, this is what happened? It's quite an interesting thing to consider. All of that is a little bit of background to the variation in Gabby's name, right? And the key thing to notice is the size variation in Gabby's name. You can also go and look at other words that appear over and over again, and I'm going to touch on that a little bit later. The same words are repeated. I think you have the same thing in the Ramsey ransom note. When you have the same word that is repeated, you really want to put them next to each other and say, is there a lot of variation here? Is there consistency or is there inconsistency? Is it, are they like congruent or are they incongruent? Because that's going to kind of give you a sense of what's going on with this person. Because the inconsistency of the handwriting speaks a bit about the inconsistency and reliability and credibility of the person as well. So the fact that Gabby's name varies in size as much as it does is a big cause of concern. It's like, what is going on? And part of that, I think, is his view of Gabby is variable. Even what he says if you take the content of this letter, he's saying she was the love of my life and, she meant the world to me and all that kind of thing. But he also killed her. So obviously it's like this thing of she means everything to me, but also she's the death of me kind of thing. And so you can almost imagine you would see that variation because his attitude towards her is variable. He thinks a lot of her, and so her name can be big and appropriate. And then I think he also has other thoughts about her, and her name is tiny. It's almost barely legible. It's so small. It's like a quarter of the height of between the lines. Tiny, and not just once. So the size variation of Gabby's name is enormous. It's difficult to overstate that. There's plenty of other variation too. So it's not just the fact that the size of her name changes. There's also variation in the removal of a capital letter. Her name starts with a capital letter, and after that, it's never a capital letter again. There's also the fact that the first reference to a name, it tilts slightly upwards and all the others seem to go downwards, especially the last couple. So you have the tilting of the name seesawing down with the Y of Gabby actually drifting below the line, especially in the final references to her. Corporal Deb says, if I can't have Gabby, no one can mentality. Yeah. Okay, so you really want to juxtapose, and I did do this in the Patreon script, where you put to scale his first reference to Gabby and one of the last references, not the very last, but one of the last references to her where he says, Gabby, I'm sorry. You put them where the lines correspond. So it's Gabby in 2 lines, and then Gabby, and you put where the 2 lines touch one another, and then you can compare just how small the second reference is to the first one. And it's really incredible. It's like a third is as large or even less. The Y is especially tiny. So this is my interpretation. Thanks a lot, Sarah Hathaway. Any relation to Anne? Okay, so my interpretation is this variation indicates the unsettled nature not only of Brian's emotional state, but also his identity. The fact that he can't settle on sizing Gabby's name isn't just a sign of his attitude to her, but also his own identity. And I think this is because Brian doesn't know who he is. Remember, he doesn't really have a job. And in a weird way, on the van life thing, Gabby had a job. He didn't really have a job. He was sort of the driver. He was sort of the guy who was like, let's enjoy ourselves, let's hike, kind of thing. So his status hasn't been settled either in his own mind, right? And bear in mind, while all of this is taking place, the social media for both of them is taking off in different ways. Hers probably is, although slowly. His probably isn't, and that's also unsettling his identity. And you have to be concerned that the social media thing is pulling her away from him, and also pulling him away from her. I hope I've brought enough water. Okay, so for a while, so his status hasn't been settled either, even in his own mind. It's not settled in the eyes of the world, or in terms of Gabby, and to some extent, even in terms of Gabby's family. I think the only area where his status is somewhat settled is in terms of his family, but is that real? Like what your mommy or your daddy thinks of you, or what your family thinks of you when you're sitting at home, you did good enough, or well enough, you are good enough, right? Well, what about when you go out into the real world? Is it quite like that? When you go to high school, what happens then? It's not the status quo of being at home, it's the status quo of high school. And then beyond that, the job situation, the world kind of thing. So I think for a while, Gabby played a crucial role in cementing Brian's status. And I'm talking about from Brian's perspective. Like, if Brian is like, this is my status, this is the status I see for myself, whatever, I think Gabby played a crucial role in that. And a lot of that was, she's my fiancée, right? But his status was always vis-a-vis his relationship with her. And I think there was an aspect to that where there was a sense of belonging, and it was good. But there's also an aspect to that where you realize, well, I'm nothing. Without you, I'm nothing. And sometimes you're not very nice to me. And then what does that mean? Right? So I think Brian's status was always vis-a-vis his relationship to Gabby, and to some extent his control of her. But he can't even decide how to address Gabby. I'm talking about in this confession. Here he can't even decide how to address Gabby. There's no consistency even in how he writes her name. In fact, besides the variation in size and in tilt, he also refers to Gabby as Gab. So it's Gabby with a capital G, Gabby with a small g, and Gabs within those 7 references to her name. So I think reinforcement for this notion of a Brian that's still fishing for a sense of self is that he doesn't even sign his name to the note or date it. Have you guys thought about that? Like, he doesn't actually even, it's like his very last letter, it's his very last communication with anyone ever, right? On earth. Like, nothing more is going to be said by him ever, and he doesn't even sign his name to it. It says Gabby's name, but he doesn't even say his own name. Just have a look at some of what you guys say. Mel says, I agree. Autumn Renee says, wow, great point. Thought Criminal says, they loved as much, if not more than me. I think that's a reference to his family, loving her, Valerie says, I think the whole letter was all about him. That's a great point. I'm coming to that. Pauline says, yes, that was peculiar. Terry says, I noticed no signature right away. Bria says, even OJ signed his name. Okay. Even in the Ramsey ransom note, it's signed SBTC, right? Leah Simpson says, interesting, he didn't sign his name. Mad Mechanic says, and the last thing about littering, that's really his opinion. Well, it might have been Gabby's opinion. I know I know he had a strong view about drinking bottled water. So let's go on. To reiterate, his signature signed a year earlier is very clumsy, it's unpracticed, it's small and weak. And you could make the argument maybe it's not his signature, maybe Gabby signed for him. Sometimes young people do that. But if it is his signature, it's clumsy, unpracticed, small and weak, and one would actually like to see his signature. I think also the fact that this note doesn't even include a signature, but instead a rather weak comment about picking up litter, shows a really weak personality. You know, is that the last word you want to say? Pick up litter. He also seems to want his own remains torn apart by animals because he expresses that this will please others. So he's kind of saying, I hope this happens because it'll please these other people. It's not because I want it to happen. He doesn't really say much in the letter where he's really saying, this is, you know, I'm gonna be gone, and what I would like you to do is X, Y, Z. There's almost nothing there. There's very little taking responsibility. I just mean, like, you know, what about the van? What about certain possessions of his? What about, I don't know, just, it's like very amateurish in that sense. I suppose he doesn't have very many possessions anyway, but still, saying what I would like to happen is my remains to be torn apart because this will please somebody else. What about what you want? There is a little bit where he talks about, please don't give my folks a hard time. But yeah, it seems like he hasn't really thought very much about his legacy other than I want to be married to Gabby. So all of this is really important and relevant when you think about the whole point of this was that they were going to leave on the 2nd of July. I think it's about a week from now, a little bit less than a week from now. So it would be a week from now, and then a year ago. They were leaving on this adventure, and the whole idea was they were going to make a living as social media influencers. Now, what do you think this confessional note says about Brian's ability to market himself and inspire other people and be convincing and say things in a memorable way, kind of thing? So, you know, if you just talk about, he doesn't even include a signature. There's a weak comment about picking up litter, and something about animals must tear him apart. That'll please somebody else. So much for his sense of self-expression so pridefully on Instagram. Do you guys remember him standing beside a tree? It's one of his last posts. Of course, his Instagram's taken down. But can you remember, I think it's one of his last posts, he's sort of between some rocks and there's a tree, Juniperus osteosperma, and he wrote the following. This is a quote from that. He said, "This tree was surviving in only inches of soil in an area of extreme heat and drought. I think our culture, our society, has put itself above all living creatures, creating needs purely to support destructive economic practices," end quote. So, I mean, that's quite authoritative. That sounds like a guy that has some strong feelings. And then you read this confessional and it doesn't read like that at all. And of course, Brian was reading this book quite a lot, right? He kept taking photos of this book and himself reading this book, right? So I think if you take what he says there, I think our culture, our society has put itself above all living creatures, creating blah, 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 blah. And then he says, so, I mean, if Brian feels our species has elevated itself above all living creatures, Brian himself seems to see himself demoted to below the animal kingdom, even litter. The animals must tear him apart and please pick up the litter, kind of thing. That's how, to what extent he's demoted himself in his own mind. So in sum, and I think this is my last point, we only had the first point here, The variations in Gabby's name, combined with his failure to sign off on his final letter, show an unusually shaky self-esteem. I don't think any of this is rocket science. I don't think I'm telling you something you don't know, but I'm trying to show you how it's anchored in his writing. It shows you, you see how the reinforcement comes from there. I've also got in front of me another Instagram post. Remember, he called himself Bizarre Design. That's also a little bit of it's maybe a strange way to refer to yourself. I am bizarre, right? Anyway, he says reading is, you kind of get the idea he's got a funny sense of humor, kind of a deprecating sense of humor, but also from a low self-esteem perspective. On August 26, 2020, he posted the following. He said, reading is different than any other consumption of media. It takes more effort, and then he writes that staring should be than staring at a screen half alive. It allows you to use your brain rather than melt it. And there's no author more stimulation to me, should be stimulating to me than Chuck Palahniuk. And that's obviously this author. And he's actually got the corner of the book Lullaby in this particular Instagram post. But that's also quite a strong words, speaking quite effectively on Instagram, although there are 2 spelling mistakes there. But kind of definitely trying to sound, I guess, a bit smarter than what he really is. So, it's also worth noting that while he mentions Gabby's name 7 times and doesn't mention his own name, even in signing off, he mentions other names as well. It's not that he just mentions Gabby's name and he doesn't mention his own. He also mentions other names, including James, which is, I think, Jim. TJ is actually mentioned twice, so that's 3 names that are mentioned. And then there are 2 other names that are mentioned that are sort of illegible. I'm not sure if those are nephews or pets or whatever it is, but if you add it all up, it's really 5 names are mentioned at different occasions. So James, that's for Jim, TJ again, and then 2 other names, that's 5. And then he doesn't even mention his name. He also refers to place names such as Utah, Spread Creek, and Crystal Gazer. Again, he mentions all of that, still doesn't mention his name. So I'm just saying, when you put all of that into context, the fact that he doesn't mention his own name is quite significant. Now we come to the second point of the 7, and this is colorful language. Let's just have a quick look at what you guys are saying here. Well, chat's coming through pretty quickly. Angela says, I spoke of this yesterday, but people actually, okay. Terry says, I'm not on Insta. Does anyone know if he had misspellings in his post? Well, I've just mentioned 2 in one post. Stephanie, welcome. Thanks for joining us. April says in her video, she talks about a plan before you set out, about having a set person in case you want to quit or get mad at each other. I think her person she picked was Rose, and it was her birthday. Yeah, that's a good point. Hey, Mel Stiller says, despite his big ego, Brian is quite self-effacing at the end. That's also true. I would also say the fact that he lies and misleads isn't that self-effacing. If he was truly self-effacing, if there's truly contrition, then he would be more truthful. It may be not absolutely truthful, but he's not even nearly truthful here. So anyway, let's move on to colorful language. And that's kind of a true crime rocket scientism. It's something that I often talk about. With the Chris Watts case I spoke about, we spoke about Broken Earth, and just things that stand out to me as someone who's written a lot of books where you think, wow, that's an unusual thing to say under these circumstances. So handwriting analysis that takes no note of the content or the facts of the case, in other words, the context, is for me very one-dimensional. It's a little bit like where you do behavioral analysis. And I remember a panel did this with, I think it was the John Benet Ramsey case. And then they're like, we're not going to talk about any of the facts. And I don't know if they knew the facts so well, but when you do it in a vacuum, I find it very one-dimensional and of little use. You need to do it both ways. You need to know the facts of the case, and you need to sync up the behavior or whatever the insights that you're getting. It doesn't help doing it kind of in a vacuum. So the same with handwriting analysis. You don't just do handwriting analysis and say, well, look at the T and the I that's dotted that way. What is the actual content of the handwriting as well? And that's one of the very underestimated aspects to the Ramsey ransom note, where people said, actually, it looks like a woman wrote this note. Also, someone who watched quite a lot of movies, and so on and so on and so on. So the context is also very important. The same with Brian's thing here as well. So the 773 page note, if you want to call it that, or confessional. So it's not 773 words. The 773 word confessional contains some colorful language, and I'm going to highlight some of it. Colorful language is just expressions that stand out or seem otherwise out of place. These are a couple that stood out to me. One was, I wouldn't want them to spend time in jail over my mistake, right? So I am taking it out of context, but you're going to see why. So let me repeat that. He says, I wouldn't want them to spend time in jail over my mistake. Now, often when you write things, you write what you've been thinking about. And often what you speak about what you've been feeling or thinking about. And so the words you use very often, you also want to take note of, because that resonates in some way with you. And you also want to note someone you're talking to who uses a word a lot, whether it's unhappy or excited or down or not sure or afraid or whatever. A word that comes up over and over again, that probably is something that they're feeling, and they may not even know that consciously. And that's why you should pay attention to your own words as well. What words do you commonly use? What words are you using more often? I know a word that I've been using quite a lot is overwhelmed. I'm feeling overwhelmed, kind of thing. But I think that's true of so many people. Anyway, if you take this statement, I wouldn't want them to spend time in jail over my mistake, right? And I wonder whether this isn't really a reference to his own parents, even if subconsciously. Think about that in that context. I wouldn't want them to spend time in jail over my mistake. And I say, I wonder whether this isn't really a reference to his own parents, even if subconsciously. By the way, Stephanie, I don't know if you want to follow this on Patreon. If you do, or if you aren't yet, it's at that point. Thought Criminal says, great point, thanks for that. Because bear in mind, if Brian did stay at home, if there was a situation where he didn't go into this park and let's say he relied or he allowed his parents perhaps to do what perhaps they volunteered to do, I wouldn't want them to spend time in jail over my mistake, right? Just think about it like that. So here's another one. Falling asleep to the sight of meteors, I think at the Crystal Geyser or Geysir, right? Falling asleep to the sight of meteors, and then this reference to this geyser, right? Now, you might think this is taking it a bit far, but just hear me out. This may be a symbolic analogy to Gabby's death. You must bear in mind his thinking is very compromised. He's just a lot is flowing out of him. Some of it's quite chaotic. Some of it is ill-considered in a way. And so one of the last things he says on that first page is, falling asleep to the sight of meteors and something about the crystal geyser, right? Geyser. As I said, this may be a symbolic analogy to Gabby's death. It's the last thing he describes before signing off with, I will always love you. When you write something, I know this is a writer, but it's also true when you're talking to someone, often the first thing you say and the last thing you say has got particular significance. The same is true when you write something. Often the thing you've been meaning to say all along is the thing you say right at the end. Sometimes it's right at the beginning. With Brian, he ends off that first page with, I will always love you, but what's significant also is what's immediately before that. The same also applies to the very last page, right? So in terms of this thing, falling asleep to the sight of meteors, think of the symbolism of fluids gushing through rocky crevices and falling asleep, and the specific circumstances of the incident when Gabby lost her life. There were rocks there was the river flowing there, but there was also a cranium and other things. And he's talking about falling asleep, which is losing consciousness to the sight of meteors and this geyser that is doing its thing. Then he also mentions the blazing hot national parks in Utah. He could have just said coming from Utah or something like that. Blazing hot. This seems to indicate the Moab incident in some shape or form, that there was still a powerful residual memory in Brian's mind. He brings up blazing hot national parks in Utah. The day, if you guys know about the Moab incident, you know that was a particularly hot day. If you guys have watched my deep dives, you know that even the officers on scene repeatedly said to Brian and Gabby, can I get you some water? And Gabby took 2 bottles, and Brian kept saying no. And that was something they also argued about. Brian refused to drink bottled water. Gabby was really, really thirsty. And that was a particularly hot day. It's one of the reasons why the officer had Gabby sit inside his vehicle and I think left the engine on so that she could kind of cool off, right? Someone says may have a kind of be a reference to a temper, blazing. So one must also remember that Brian narrowly escaped disaster during that incident. You can say what you will about Gabby, but he narrowly escaped disaster, bearing in mind he was inevitably going towards disaster, right? So he narrowly escaped disaster during the Moab incident. And when he found himself in the midst of another incident, he probably decided to take matters into his own hands. Maybe things were escalating. Then he did something at a certain point and it was like, I don't want to, the police spoke to me like that. This is going to be harder to explain. And so maybe that's why he took matters into his own hands, precisely because he wanted to avoid facing punishment. And he actually volunteers the word punishment in his confession as well. Then I'm going to deal with 3 more. He writes, spooned her as close to the heat. And it even doesn't really go together, these words. It sort of seems like grammatically incorrect or just not well thought out. But he writes, spooned her as close to the heat. And I don't know about you guys, but to me, this is quite an unusually intimate reference, quite an intimate thing to say to nobody in particular, to strangers. Spooned with my girlfriend or whatever. It's a unusually intimate reference, but I think it reveals to what extent Brian's love for Gabby was based on lust. I also think it reveals some of the obvious things that were taking place between Brian and Gabby, just like on a not a daily basis, but often when they were sort of together camping. And that was something that was, it's obviously in his heart and in his mind, and now it's no longer there, right? Teresa Moore says Brian appears to be narcissistic. Carol says, very interesting. He didn't say anything directly to his parents, not even I love you and I'm sorry. Actually, he did. He did say I'm sorry in terms of his parents. Autumn says, Katie says he doesn't sound like a well-read person at all. That was my impression. That was definitely my impression. Okay, then there's another one where he says these words. He says, her whole painful cycle again. Wow, gathering place. Thanks very much. Nick, I had a strange dream. You were in it. I had a bad dance with COVID. Well, I hope the dream ended with you being happy and healthy, at least, especially if you're making that kind of contribution. And I hope that there was I also had a very strange dream earlier today. I kind of slept during a power failure. Definitely was quite strange. Anyway, thanks a lot, Gathering Place. So another colorful expression is her whole painful cycle again. Have you ever spoken about anyone else using those words? Her whole painful cycle again. Now this, I think, could be a reference to several possibilities. One that we know of is that Gabby and Brian often argued and were in an on-again, off-again situation for years, actually. And I think people just kind of, they would break up and it would be on again, off again, and people would just stop really paying attention to it. They would just stop paying attention to their arguments because it was like, oh, well, it's drama again, but they'll kind of get back together. Think about those words, her whole painful cycle again. And this is possibly an allusion to the escalating problems that were sneaking up on them day by day, week after week, during their van life journey. Remember, he doesn't actually mention it. He doesn't say we argued, because we know they did. He doesn't say we disagreed. We know they did. He doesn't say we fought. We know they did. He does say her whole painful cycle again. Is this an allusion to these escalating problems? And they were escalating day after day, week after week during their van life journey. As I said, it's not something he otherwise acknowledges that there was anything wrong with their relationship. In fact, he sketches what happens as her kind of walking into the stream and tripping. It's sort of totally random. It's got nothing to do with him. It's got nothing to do with what he said. It's got nothing to do with how she feels, any of that. So he doesn't acknowledge anything about Gabby's personality besides her not liking litterbugs. He doesn't say anything about what she really says either, nothing verbatim. He doesn't even say what her last words are to him, which I think is also significant. And then we go to, or his last words to her. It's not like he says to her, I love you, before this mercy thing that he's doing. He doesn't say anything about tears either, that she's crying, that he's crying. And then the final one, lapsing between violent shakes, gasping in pain, begging. Think about those words, lapsing, gasping, begging. Those are three awfully descriptive words juxtaposed to one another. Okay, and that brings us to the third insight. It's poor planning and execution. What I want you to think about is specifically Brian's van life journey in the context of social media, in the context of finances, and ultimately what happened in terms of his relationship with him and Gabby, with the Moab incident and everything else. And you've got to ask, was this well planned, right? And I think Gabby's family said they did plan it for a long time and they did whatever they did, right? But I want you to think about it in a totally different way. I want you to think about, and I think it's got a really strong bearing on Brian's social media. They are actually going on this trip to become social media influencers, right? And how good is Brian at just writing out these pages, right? So when I prepared this live stream, I kind of wrote out a whole script, and I could have, I suppose, had it filled with spelling mistakes, and had it, maybe I could have written it on a piece of paper like that, right? And that could have been what I was going to do. But I typed it out, I put photos next to one another, I spent hours and hours on it. I wrote it down, I read through it, I edited it, and so on. How much time and effort and forethought and afterthought did Brian spend? And also, did he ever like write something or pause and think, what am I going to write, and then write it? Or did he just sort of write it and, stream of consciousness? So think about his writing in terms of the specific 8-page letter, and think of that in the context of poor planning / execution. So 3 of the 8 pages are extremely messy and confusing, particularly page 1, especially the first page. You sort of think, maybe you should have just torn that page out and rewritten it. And that's why I also wonder, does he want people to think that he was really distressed? Because it seems very odd to have such a terribly executed page. Casey says he signs it with pick up the trash. Very strange. Yeah, I did mention that. Stephanie says he's a horrible excuse of a human making excuses for himself, no accountability. April C says, I didn't hear anything to his sister or her. He does actually mention aunt and nephew, so there's an indirect reference. Okay, Stephanie says, yes, the page addressing Gabby's personality is the messiest. True Jedi Forever, good to see you here. Okay, Giblet of NH says, I wonder why I didn't just own up. Because I think he's so pathetic that he sort of feels like there's just something he wants to hold on to. He wants his parents perhaps to think well of him or something. So the first page is extremely messy. It's the messiest. It's confusing, but the worst crossing out of the entire statement occurs near the bottom of page 2. And it's so bad that I think I would be like, okay, I'll rewrite this page. It's really not a lot of words. I'm a journalist and I've written 100 books, so it would be no big deal for me to write 773 words all over again. In fact, I do it all the time. I mean, I do it if I'm not writing a book anyway. I was often writing magazine articles of 2,000 words, sometimes 10,000 words. It's actually incredible to me that this last statement of his, which deals with also what happened to Gabby, is less than 1,000 words, which is quite a short magazine article. It's like, that's your final statement. I also thought, where's his sketches? Where's all the other stuff that he was thinking about, when he was reading books like this? And, where's all the journaling? Where's that? Maybe there's more out there. Who knows? Anyway, so the first page is a mess. The second page has got this horrible crossed out section. We are dealing with number 3, poor planning and execution, in terms of him writing a letter, and then how does that apply to his personal life, his travel life, his finances, wanting to marry someone, right? So one of Gabby's criticisms of Brian, you might remember this, was that he was dirty and untidy. Do you remember that? Not so much that, I don't know if he was physically untidy, but that he would allow the van to be untidy, kind of thing. So his writing etiquette mirrors this, doesn't it? Don't you think his writing is not necessarily dirty, but it's messy, and it's untidy? I certainly have higher standards where I would say, okay, this needs to look like that. I don't know what the normal standard is for notes when you are going to take your own life. I don't know whether one can say someone's really going to care about that one way or the other, but some people would actually, I think. Anyway, in a statement he expected to be seen by the world. Despite making a royal mess of the first page, he nevertheless persisted with it instead of starting over. Again, it's possible as an artist he wanted to communicate that he felt emotional and mixed up, and perhaps that was on purpose. But even if this was his intention, I mean, he could simply have said, I'm feeling very emotional and raw and confused. He could have said that instead of trying to show it. But the impression it leaves is of a confused, messy, reckless, and somewhat random personality. Random, like he's writing a thing and then he just like writes all over the place. Like, don't you have a plan? You can stop and start again and do it properly. So, but you just kind of continue randomly. And what if you on a trip and things aren't going well? Don't you also stop and take stock and sort things out? You just carry on. And although that is a mess, the next thing's a mess as well. Page 2, as I say, with a line and a half heavily excised, you'd imagine an artist with standards would have redrafted it. The same applies maybe to a less extent with page 4. On page 6, he writes over the word new, and it's just a little bit of a gripe, and also ends that sentence under the bottom line. So there's the bottom line, and then he writes under that. So you might think, wow, this is all very nitpicky, and what are you actually talking about? But when you compare Brian's pages to, for example, the Ramsey ransom note, although there is actually some variability in the handwriting of the Ramsey ransom note, the 3 pages look positively pristine compared to Brian's topsy-turvy mess. We also know that the author of the Ramsey note wrote at least one practice note. So even the Ramsey ransom note writer was like, wow, that's not really the way I want it. Let's do it again. Let's execute it better. Brian could have done the same thing. Brian clearly did not write any practice notes, and what's more, seemed not to think through much of what he did write. I don't know if you've noticed, there's certain sentences that just don't really work. It's like, wow, what did you actually say there? The note itself is also filled with grammatical errors, and besides being hard to read, it is at times difficult to make sense of. So again, it comes back to even when he's writing a short thing, have you planned it out? Are you kind of anticipating what you're going to say and thinking about it? Are you able to do that? This is important because you're going to think, was he able to do that with his wedding? Was he able to do it with this van life thing? You might argue quite stridently, yes, he was planning and whatever, but sometimes young people plan in a way that is like a fairy tale. It's more like daydreaming. It's not really realistic. That's not planning. Planning is where you do things properly and you prepare in a proper way. For example, money. For example, start setting up your social media. Anyway, even Chris Watts in his letters to an author clearly went to a lot of trouble to write them by hand without any flaws, no crossing out whatsoever, no formatting issues, all of it very neat, all of it very consistent. So when you juxtapose Brian's confession with Chris Watts's letters and the Ramsey ransom note, you see just how messy and untidy it is. And that brings us to the 4th point, spelling. And I've really just I've compiled a list of everything he spelled wrong. So ironically, the spelling errors in the Ramsey ransom note are likely intentional. The person who misspelled, I think one of the words that's misspelled is business. Can't remember what the other one was. I don't know if Cotton Star is still here, but business was the one misspelled word. But it was likely intentionally misspelled to make the person seem not quite as smart or educated as they actually were. but you could tell that the writer kind of knew what they were talking about with other words that they use, like attaché, countermeasures, faction, and deviation. Not everyone uses those words. When you look at Brian's misspellings and his overall vocabulary, you can see it's at a much lower level. It's kind of at a different order of magnitude of terrible. So something that's, in the beginning, I started making notes of this, but eventually I felt like I'm a grammar teacher, and he seemed to not use apostrophes at all. Like, I'm just not going to use them. So I started picking up spelling errors on page 1 with weave spelled without an apostrophe and can't without an apostrophe. I don't know. Do you do that? I don't know if it's the texting generation or millennials. Maybe they write that way. You just don't put it in. Corporal Deb says they don't mix. Yeah, I think that's definitely something you could say. But I think this isn't just that kind of note. It's also to say this is what happened to Gabby. So it's not just whatever. It goes a bit beyond that. In the bottom third of the page, he spells close with a Z. That's pretty scary. And meteor with an I. I think it's Metior or something. And he spells geyser, Gerser. He spells flipping, like flipping through cards, with one P. Then there are just a couple that are highlighted, missing apostrophes. Gabs, meaning Gabs' journal. And wouldn't and I'm and you'll, all missing apostrophes. Wouldn't in approximately line 8. This is on page 2. Looks like it's spelled WOULDT. Grief is spelled GREIF. If you go to page 3, occurred is spelled OCCURED with just one R. Tragedy, it's really hard to make out how he's spelling it, but it looks like TRADIJDY. Let me spell that out again. It looks like he's spelling it TRADIJDY. The J doesn't have an I on it, so it almost looks like he's sort of just put a squiggle there because he hasn't even decided how he's going to spell it. And then there's just a little bit of a niggle with where he writes too, as in too cold, spelled alternatively with one O and two O's. Now we go to page 5. Concussion is spelled concusion, CONCUSION, instead of two S's. Just had one spelling mistake. On page 6, he really butchers injuries. Looks like he spells it INGERRYS, like in and the word Jerry's. Injuries. And then it just makes you wonder, does injuries never come up in this book that he read? Has he never seen the word injury before? On page 8, animals is spelled with two N's, ANNIMALS, and apart is spelled APPART. You just kind of wonder if this dude had to go onto Instagram, no one would really take him seriously. It's like, wow. So there are at least 10 pretty simple words that Brian butchers in his attempt to spell them. So the silliness of these misspellings in some show Brian to be he seems to be poorly educated. He seems very ill-prepared. It feels like he's ill-prepared when he's writing this note. Thanks a lot, Amy Hall. And it makes you feel like he's ill-prepared for other things, ill-prepared for marriage, ill-prepared to be a van lifer, ill-prepared for life. He just seems ill-prepared. And despite being poorly educated, despite being ill-prepared, he's got these high hopes of marrying Gabby, these high hopes of having this adventure. And yet he actually has no hope of making it as an Instagram influencer. You can kind of see that from a mile away. To be an Instagram influencer, but basically to be a social media personality, you've got to have the gift of the gab at least somewhat. You've got to especially on Instagram, you've got to kind of be liked by the camera. And so often it's both, have the gift of the gab and be liked by the camera, or at least one of them. Brian clearly was always going to be a non-starter on social media, and probably Gabby had to help him out with his captions. She probably had to tell him, well, you spelt that wrong. And perhaps every time she did, he felt embarrassed. Perhaps this aspect also convinced her that Brian wasn't an intellectual match for her either. Maybe Brian always reading books or looking like he's reading books was like a way to show her that he was quite smart or something. I don't know. But most people don't read books over and over and over again. Okay, so now we're going to go on to quite a, I think, interesting aspect. It's something I typically do with my statement analysis. So this is like handwriting and statement. And as I said, you must also talk about content and context. Now we're going to deal with the most words that are used in his statement. And it's quite easy to do this. You copy all the full transcript onto Word, and then you do a couple of strategic word searches, right? So any of you want to volunteer what you think is the most used word in Brian's confession? What do you think is the word that he uses the most? Any thoughts? Anyone got any ideas? So let's just go. Let's go back to the poll. I see 365 of you have voted. If you haven't voted, make sure you do. 83% are saying, can you change yourself by changing your handwriting? We're going to come back to that. Yeah, that's a really good point. All of you saying I or me. It's a really good point. So I actually did try and search I, and of course, all the little letters I come up, and it's difficult to navigate beyond that. If someone can actually count all the I's for like I, that would be great. But this is what I highlighted, and it's under point number 5. Most words used. Pain. The word pain comes up 7 times. Right? Pain comes up 7 times, and undoubtedly there was a lot of emotional pain and undoubtedly a lot of physical pain. I'm talking about for Gabby and Brian. I'm talking about for Brian, well, I don't know at the very end of his life whether there was much physical pain, but it certainly is a catastrophic thing to happen to a person, what happened to him, right? So anyway, pain comes up 7 times. Family comes up 5 times, right? So pain 7, family 5. Family even comes up at the very end of the statement, as I say, which that's quite important, where he refers to making Gabby's family happy. And maybe this was a bugbear for him. Maybe he felt like he couldn't make her family happy. Maybe her family weren't, certain members of her family weren't very happy with him, or didn't accept him, or didn't like him, or whatever. So pain 7 times, family 5 times, love comes up 5 times as well. Sorry comes up 5 times as well. It's interesting that he starts off by saying, I'm sorry to everyone. I'm sorry to her family. I'm sorry to my family. If you just think about that again, it's just using some critical thinking. You'd imagine the correct priority would be, besides apologizing to Gabby, first he should apologize to her folks, then his folks, and then to everyone. Not apologize to everyone first, then her family, then his family. Why on earth are you apologizing to everybody first? Who's everybody? Is it us? Is it social media? Is it the public? His first priority should be apologizing to her family, then to his family, then to everybody, right? I'm going to kind of come back, I'm going to circle back to that particular point a little bit later. Then he says either the word end, but end meaning like kill, because I think he said he ended her life or something. He meant to say the word kill, but he doesn't use the word kill. But then he also uses the word kill. If you take them together, he uses end and kill 5 times as well. So love 5 times, sorry 5 times, and if you add end and kill together 5 times as well. Fire comes up 4 times. One of the references is, from where I started the fire, I had no idea how far the car might be. Let me read that again. From where I started the fire, I had no idea how far the car might be. This speaks to Brian, I think, getting lost in the larger framework of the adventure and also his relationship, I believe. Although what he's saying now, I think, is fictional, I think it speaks to Brian getting lost in the larger framework of the adventure, of the social media, of things that were kind of unraveling, of how to deal with the finances. The word lost comes up 4 times. Freezing comes up 4 times. Freezing can also be where you freeze and you almost like have a blank or you don't know what to do, right? So freezing can be similar to lost as well. Wake, where you wake up. It can also be a shocking thing where you wake up and realize what's going on, even if you haven't been sleeping. Wake is referred to 4 times. Corporal Deb, I don't know what he scribbled out. Sorry. Sometimes if you invert the colors or you use, you highlight it, sometimes you can kind of see through it, but he's done it so hard, it's difficult to say. But what's quite interesting when he uses the word wake, he says, you'll wake up without her and you wouldn't want to wake up, right? And I think that is maybe a thought he actually repeatedly had while she was still alive. You'll wake up without her and you wouldn't want to wake up. Then future is referred to 3 times. That's obviously something he was thinking about. That's obviously something they were thinking about. Shock comes up 3 times. He says, I was in shock. Shock and lost and freezing and wake, all of those go together. Spent or spend, and obviously they were having financial trouble, comes up 3 times, spent or spend. Sleep comes up 3 times. Creek comes up 3 times. Carry or carried comes up 3 times. Gasping comes up twice. Mistake comes up twice. Violent comes up twice. Both those references to violent are him referring to shaking violently, right? Never comes up twice. Thought comes up twice, such as thought the fire would go out, thought it was merciful. Van comes up only once. Bear in mind there's a van live trip and the van only comes up once. Social media doesn't come up at all, although he does talk about feeling pain when he looks at her pictures. So I think that's an indirect reference. Said comes up just once. And that reference is quite interesting. She said little. You must remember, if he's lying next to her and his version is actually true, if he's lying next to her, she's got nowhere to go, but she can nevertheless talk. She can nevertheless, if she's saying, don't leave me, the fire might go out, or whatever it is, she can nevertheless talk. So why is she not saying anything? Why are there no last words? Why does he have no last words to her? Well, because he can't actually tell the truth about those last words. Another sentence that stands out is Brian's solitary reference to friends, where he refers to Gabby's siblings as his friends. I think this is quite a big one. He writes, I'd consider her younger siblings my best of friends. Who are his friends? Does he have any friends on social media? Does he have much of a social media following? Did he? It's quite a big statement to say, I'd consider her younger siblings my best of friends. Who else would? It's also noteworthy that while he apologizes to everybody, he apologizes to everyone in a general sense. He apologizes to her family, his family. He doesn't apologize to any of Gabby's friends. He doesn't apologize to Rose. Was Rose part of what caused him to feel like he's going to get kicked out of this adventure? She's going to get rid of him, right? What did someone say about location? Pauline says it's all very Shakespearean. Someone said something about location, but I can't find it now. Bridget Bowman, good to see you. He's worried about his self-image, I think, in the context of social media, yes. I think that's part of his whole decision to do that. He references many adoring her, but she had few friends. Well, he had even fewer friends. I think she had quite a few friends, but she'd moved states, right? I can't see that. Where's that thing about location? Corporal Deb says, we may never know what he really wanted or should have said to bring contrition. Well, I must say, I never like seeing those words in true crime, we may never know, because I think we often know a lot. If you just pay attention and you think about it long enough, you know a lot. Terry says that would be a reason Gabby would stay with him. Jean Carris says, I think he was intimidated by Rose. She was smart and kind and also attractive. And young and, all the rest. Wishful thinking says, the phrase best of friends is off. Why not just best friends? Okay. What is the word that comes up the most besides I? I don't know how often I does come up. If one of you wants to try counting, go for it. Onesie, good to see you here. Okay, there it is. Thanks a lot, Stephanie. Why didn't he tell her location in the letter? I was going to say because she'd already been found, but I don't think she had been found. Because I think he was trying to. I don't think he would have minded if they didn't find her. I think he probably feared that they would. I don't think he was trying to help the investigation. I think he was trying to just get it all over with. And I think his idea was that he will be with Gabby in the afterlife or something like that. Ray says, someone asked, why didn't Brian disclose where Gabby was in his letter? I think for the same reason he didn't say what really happened, because finding Gabby would really show that, what had really happened, So what is the word that comes up the most? My comes up 13 times. And so number 6 is me, myself, and I. My eyes, my life, my family, my mother, my knees, my things. And I do think he regarded Gabby as his thing. And without his thing, he was a no thing. He was a nothing. Hence the lack of a sign-off as well. But my comes up 13 times, is quite a lot. And that brings us to the 7th and final insight, which is what I refer to as 3 jabs, right? There are at least 3 jabs in the confession. There's actually a little bit more if you go into it. But one is to Gabby's family, basically blaming them for what is going to happen to his body. It's almost like he says, I'm going to do this to kind of make you happy. And I don't think that's what they were thinking at all. It's almost as if they told him to do what he did. But anyway, that's the first jab, and it's right at the end. It's a jab to Gabby's family. So you kind of get the feeling there's some opprobrium against Gabby's family from Brian. A second jab is also to Gabby's family, saying he wouldn't want them to go to jail over his mistake, right? He wouldn't want them to go to jail over his mistake. Now, one wonders whether that was something that was discussed. Think about this. Again, those words, he wouldn't want them to go to jail over his mistake. One wonders whether this was something that was discussed, maybe not in so many words, following the Moab incident, right? He made a mistake. with the whole Moab incident, I wouldn't want to go to jail over my mistake, kind of thing, right? Think about those words in terms of the Moab incident, and think about, did those words come up with Gabby's family, between Gabby and Gabby's family, between Brian and Brian's family, or even between only Gabby and Brian? Like, after the Moab incident, they must have spoken about it. Do you want to go to jail over the mistake that we made, right? And then you have that repeated. You have this whole idea of, I don't want to go to jail over this mistake. So you have that incident with the Moab incident, and then almost there's like an echo after that where it's like, I don't want my parents to go to jail over my mistake. It's sort of the one mistake compounded by another mistake, but it's the same kind of psychology. I don't want to go to jail. I don't want that person to go to jail. And I must say, if someone did go to jail or did go to court over the Moab incident, I don't think any of this would have happened. Calmer minds would have prevailed. Even if Gabby had gone to court, it would have been like, epiphany, this is a serious red flag that's going on. Things aren't going in the right direction. And then, of course, the final jab, in my opinion, is to Gabby, where he says, Gabby hated people who led her. It's not much of an epitaph, is it? It's not much of a thing to say about this person that means everything to you. It's not much of a last final words to someone that you love more than anything, to say, Gabby hated people who led her, right? And maybe he had a bit of a change of heart with it being like, you've finished this note, you've got the gun, what's there left for you to do? And he's sitting there and he's starting to feel upset and resentful and bitter and confused and muddled. And then he writes one more thing down. Gabby hated people who led her. And maybe it's quite a lot of things in that. Maybe it's true. Maybe she didn't like him doing that to some extent. Maybe it's him acknowledging that he was untidy in the van and that this is his penance for that. But even if all of that's true, and maybe one can have some compassion for Brian in that respect, where he's like, well, if I hadn't littered, maybe we would have gotten along and we would have lived happily ever after. No, but maybe that's how he would have been thinking. But those are like his last thoughts before he dies. I do think this whole thing about litter and cleanliness was part of the bickering inside the van. You might think, no, they were arguing about big things, but often couples argue about little things. They just can't get along on even the smallest things. Maybe they were also arguing about bigger things like money and is Rose coming along and can Rose join us for her birthday? And if it's Rose and Gabby, where's Brian going to fit into that? He's going to feel like the odd one out. Rose and Gabby are going to get along well, especially when Gabby and Brian aren't getting along well. And does Rose like Brian? And does Brian like Rose, right? Finally, and this is really just my last point here, the fact that Brian would come up with such a fanciful and ridiculous confession speaks, I think, about his insecurity as a person as well as his paranoia. I think paranoia is a big part of this story. I think he was paranoid about stuff. It's also like like people break up all the time and marriages end and all sorts of things end, and it's not fun. It's not nice. It's actually quite horrible. But when you're worrying about who the person you're with is going to be with, and obviously it's easy to be mature about it when you've been around a little bit, but it's harder, much harder when you are very much in love with someone and you're 20 years old. But I think there's an abnormal amount of paranoia here. And I think a lot of that paranoia is the paranoia that comes with social media. Who are you talking to? And I actually just saw a clip, not just, but recently saw a clip from TMZ where they are trying to dramatize the arguments between the Brian character and the Gabby character. And guess how they dramatize it? With she's on her phone, he doesn't want her to be on her phone, and they shout at each other about that. And that's also something that comes up in the Moab incident, where I think she hits him with her phone, and there's something about, isn't there somewhere in the Moab incident where someone tries to grab her phone? He tries to grab her phone or something like that. But I know that she hits him with her phone, and he also turns it around and says, what's going to happen if I'm left here without a phone? But anyway, the phone thing does come up, and you can imagine him feeling like, please get off your phone. What is happening every time you look at your phone? Is someone saying you look awesome, or I wish I could join you, or who's that idiot you're with, kind of thing. So I think paranoia is part and parcel of social media, especially if you're quite a young person. A lot of people become obsessive in terms of social media. Well, the paranoia goes in step with that, right? And you can imagine just how much it is if your whole idea is, I need to make a living out of this. And Gabby seems to make the YouTube video, not Brian. Gabby seems to be making the website, not Brian. Gabby seems to be making Instagram posts that you want to look at, not Brian. What is Brian actually doing? He's becoming paranoid. He's driving. He seems to think of the whole van life thing as a holiday. Anyway, I think it's clear that given enough time and given enough experience in the real world, Gabby would eventually leave him. But he'd made it clear that there was no life without her or for her without him. He'd made it clear that there was no life without her or for her without him. And you guys may have noticed in a lot of my YouTube videos, in the very last, the sort of credits, as the videos sort of play out, I tend to have a image of Brian where he's getting engaged to Gabby. He's dressed like in a suit. They both look quite well dressed, and then he says next to that something about he can't believe how amazing this woman is, and till death us do part. It seems like he meant that literally. It really does seem like he meant that literally. It seems like when he met her, it was like, there's no way I'm letting you go alive, and I'm not going to get alive out of it either, kind of thing. It's like literally, I can't live without you, right? Well, I'm just looking at a couple of comments here. SMK Valinsky, I'm astonished by the precision and detail within this post. A lot to absorb, but all resonate strongly with intuition. Thanks for that. Beth says, well done. He definitely was thinking about himself right to the end. So again, this is my analysis, my assessment of the handwriting. Some of it is purely the size, the shape, the tilt of it, the consistency of it, and you can go through a lot of the letters and so on. How hard does he press? Does he use the margins? All sorts of that, all things like that. But I think it's also important to look at the context and the content, and it's also very important to look at things like how many times does a word come up, because that's something that's resonating with a person. What we say, they say who we are is what we repeatedly do, but the same applies what we repeatedly say, right? And that brings us to this poll. Can you change yourself by changing your handwriting? Absolutely, absolutely. I'm not saying if you just change your handwriting, you will suddenly magically change yourself. What I am saying is, if you look at your handwriting, for example, and you say, for example, well, my handwriting is really small. My handwriting is very small. And I don't think it represents me, or I don't like the fact that it's so small. I want it to be bigger in the same way that I want to be bigger. I want to stand out more in the world, right? What is happening there is you being mindful about yourself. You being self-aware, and to the extent that anyone is self-aware, they can change themselves. So you can look at yourself in the mirror, and in terms of, for example, your handwriting, and say, I want this about myself to change. I want that about myself to change. And obviously we don't write by hand very much anymore, but if we did, you could kind of make certain changes. So another example is, you might say, I think I'm quite a shallow person. I don't like that about myself. I want to be less superficial. I feel like I'm just quite a shallow person. And then you say, assuming you were writing letters every day like Vincent van Gogh, you said, well, how are you going to change it? Well, one way that you can tell whether someone feels intensely is they tend to press quite hard on the paper. I'm definitely one of those people. I press really, really hard. Not so much, I know when I was a kid and so on, I actually won, when I was at school, I won certain things for like really good handwriting. Right now it's atrocious, of course, but I remember at school, I eventually, because I wrote so much, I started writing books when I was at school. I wrote so much that I was like, I'm not going to write the word the anymore. I'm just going to write a squiggle. It's just, everyone can see it's the, right? So I just like wrote a squiggle. And my teacher said, what's that? And I said, that's the. And she said, no, that's not. It's not, there's no THE. So I said, well, here's the kind of the code. Squiggle equals THE. And she said, no, you can't do that. But there are certain things, like if you press hard when you're writing, that is a sign that you feel things intensely. So if you weren't pressing very hard, I'm just saying you could, when you're writing, press harder and say, this is a reminder to myself that I want to be more conscientious about certain things. I want to care more about what I'm doing, right? Another example that I remember was, I was in math class, and I just loved the teacher's handwriting. I loved that she would write a Y, often like the number 7, and she would write a G, often like the number 9. I just really liked that. And I thought, I'm going to start adopting, this is when I was at school, and I thought, I'm going to start adopting that style. And I'm not sure if I followed through with it, but I definitely did adopt that style for quite a while. Not sure if that changed me. It didn't make me a more numerical fellow, but I'm just saying, anything where you have this psychology of, I want to change this about me, I want to improve this about me, and it's actually a very good thing, because we can constantly change in all sorts of areas, and even if it's small changes, we can improve our vocabularies, we can be more engaging with one another, we can be more kind, we can be more cultured, we can be more aware of the people that we don't agree with. We can understand that side of, we tend to know about our point of view. We don't tend to care or to spend too much time figuring out what is not our point of view. I'm just saying, you can kind of spend a bit of time having a bit of a more balanced view of things. What's the word? Think of these sort of alternate possibilities. Julie, thanks a lot. So you can change yourself by changing your handwriting. A good place to start is your signature. And you can say, my signature is too small, or it's too big, or it's too long, or it's too whatever. It doesn't represent me, or it's time to update my signature. So absolutely, you can constantly change yourself. But the question is, do you see the need to change in any area? Does anyone else see the need for you to change in any area? I do love the idea that you can constantly reinvent yourself. And I'm not saying that you should, like, from one day to the next reinvent yourself, but you can constantly write a new story for yourself. And that's, to me, a source of tremendous hope. If all of us can write a new story for ourselves, then our world can collectively write a new story for itself when we decide to do that individually and collectively. And there's tremendous hope in that. And so I think, when Brian writes something like, what did he say? I have killed myself, right? He's writing it in the present tense, but of course he's got to be still alive when he writes that. When he says, I have killed myself by this creek, well, actually he hasn't. And can you imagine if he wrote instead, and I'm not trying to be funny here, I'm not going to kill myself, or I've decided not to kill, but I'm just saying if he wrote that, even though you didn't feel it, you would feel like, wow, he's actually reinventing his reality. You can do the same thing. Think about what you say and how your words limit your experience. And by changing your words, you can, to some extent, change your experience. And I'm not talking about magical thinking here. I'm talking about self-limiting words, self-limiting thoughts, right? Bridget says, oh, you can. That's so interesting. Okay, so there are 80% of you say you can't change yourself by changing your handwriting. I do want to acknowledge that you can't just like this change your handwriting and change yourself. But you can certainly, in terms of a process, if you're being self-aware, you can certainly change yourself. As I say, if you just had to look at your signature and say, let's say that signature we saw in the tattoo release, let's say it really was Brian's, and you say, well, you need to have a proper sense of yourself. You need to have a bit of a flourish. You've got to have some personality. You've got to have something. You've got to bring something to the table. This signature doesn't bring anything to the table. Bring something to the table. And so every time you sign your name, there's this awareness that you're challenging yourself to, it's like somebody said, Chris Watts has got no game. You've got to develop a game. You've got to develop a game plan. You've got to, bring it, kind of thing. And so your signature is kind of a way where you say to yourself, I'm bringing it. Wishful thinking, interesting avatar in terms of what we're talking about here. Handwriting is a creative process which facilitates self-expression to the world. So, I'm not a psychologist, but I think something that you could possibly do, even if one person here does that, I see there are about 320 of you in chat, even if one of you does this, if you decide, I want to make some changes in my life, right? And you say, every day I'm going to take out a piece of paper and I'm either going to write something that I want to self-actualize, or maybe it's I want to be more confident, or I want to be neater, or I want to be on time, or I want to be more consistent, or I want to work less, or I want to exercise more. Simply writing that down. So let's say I want to exercise more. Simply writing that down is one way to do that. And while you're writing it down, you don't just write it down, you think about how you're writing it. You write it with emphasis, exclamation mark, maybe you underline it. Maybe you feel like, wow, this is actually a celebration and I really mean this and it's exciting. And then you write the words bigger. And so in a way, the way that you're writing is a self-actualizing, reinforcing psychology. It's kind of slowing you down into the moment where you are observing yourself, and you're observing yourself writing your own actions, kind of thing, right? I'm just trying to take this really sad, tragic, unpleasant, and in some ways disgusting letter of Brian's, and I'm trying to show you that there's a flip side to it, where you can use writing in a positive way, write positive aphorisms for yourself. And I don't mean empty things like just do it. I'm talking about things that really mean something to you, like I must exercise more, or I must call my dad, or whatever it is, or I want to be larger than life, right? While you're writing those words, you can focus on that. So you don't just like write it with a squiggle. You focus on it, and you don't type it out, you write it out. And to the extent that you write it out each day, how can you change that writing? Exclamation mark, underline it, sign your name. But think about yourself in terms of that, how you're feeling about yourself and what needs to change in order to improve who you are, kind of thing. And there are a lot of other ways to do that besides just writing 1 or 2 or 3 words. You can write a diary, you can keep a journal. And I've found that to be pretty useful as well, especially if you're going through a process in your life, whether it's healing from a sickness, healing from a relationship that's not working, going on a trip. I mean, that's a big one. If you go on a trip, you're traveling somewhere, keep a journal of it. And then you can actually come back after that. You can open that journal and it transports you to a lot of those moments a lot better than a photo can. That's the amazing power of writing. Okay, I think we almost at the 2-hour mark. That's me meeting my goal. Hope you guys have found this a interesting analysis. Wishful thinking says look into SMART goals and writing those out, posting them prominently to keep new habits foremost in mind. One thing I can tell you guys that I lived through that was very interesting was I trained for the Ironman. You see a sample of my handwriting. Can you read it? The power of, thanks a lot, Terry. One thing that I can share with you guys that was it's a practical example, was I was training for the Ironman, and this was when I lived in South Korea. I was doing things like, it's like world class, not world class, but just obscene amounts of training, like riding 150 kilometers in one day. So it would sometimes be 6 or 7 hours of cycling in a single day. But anyway, just huge amounts of training, only to overtrain and get ill, and then do the whole thing again. Train. And so this happened twice in a row. And so for the third time, high level, for the third time, I was like, I don't know if I can actually do this again. I don't know if I've got the resources to train again. And I don't know if I can do it. And then I thought, for this third attempt, I've got to do something different, because I'm feeling like if I fail a third time, I don't know what I'm going to do. I felt like it was going to make me as a person or break me as a person, kind of thing. And I was just like, I'm going to try for the third time, but I've got to do something different. And so I started a blog, and it was called Third Time Lucky. It was 3x Luck. And the blog was originally like a blogger blog. So it was 3xluck.blogspot.com. And all I did was I just chronicled my workouts, and I spoke about either a workout that I did, or I wrote down a race report, or I wrote about something that was happening in the sport that I found interesting. And I guess it was an introduction to blogging, but it was also holding myself accountable. So I was writing about a workout that I did. I was writing about some of the equipment that was being used. I was writing about if I did a race, I would write a race report and all that kind of thing. And so what that did was it chronicled my journey in terms of holding myself accountable to it. So I couldn't just walk away from it when things didn't go well. And does that make sense? And so it provided a sense of anchoring me to a different narrative, not just the narrative of what I'd done and what I was doing, but also it's written down, it's there. Also, I've said what I'm doing. And there's a nasty flip side to this. It's where you say something on social media and then it becomes more important what you've said on social media. I think a blog or a diary is maybe a better thing than just saying on Facebook, I'm going to gym today, kind of thing. You must also be self-starting inwardly. You shouldn't be doing it for. There are a lot of people who go to gym and then it's a big pageant, in terms of that. That shouldn't be the point. Unless it gets you out of bed and gets you to gym, whatever floats your boat. I'm just saying, training for the Ironman the third time, when I blogged about it, that made me accountable, and it was also writing it down. And so that made you just think about things a little bit more. And it also made it, because I did actually get sick for the third Ironman, and there was a moment where it didn't feel like it was going to happen. But a lot of the thinking was there, and everything was, all the preparations were there as well. And then I ended up doing it, and it was an amazing experience, and I did end up doing it. I'm just saying that's where writing can change your life in a way. Especially if you're doing something difficult, especially if it's a journey, especially if it's something that is quite personal. You don't necessarily have to share it with the world either. You can write it in a diary, something like that. Hedy Lamar says, hello, Rocketeers. Hedy, you are just in time to hear and see a lot of us say goodbye. Zircon says, focused mind with body. Absolutely. Stephanie says, I blogged about my life once upon a time. Yeah, I mean, blogging is almost quite passe at the now. But I think it's got its place. And as I say, it doesn't need to be. The nice thing with a blog is sometimes there are people out there that also need support and encouragement. And sometimes it's a weird way of forming a community just around a simple thing. And it can take you all sorts of places. Bonnie Carey says maybe, okay. Wishful Thinking says, I feel like I would either keep up the blog or do the work. Keeping records is too much like work. Yeah, I think it depends on what kind of person you are. I like seeing numbers. So I like seeing numbers and percentages and all that. So I don't just see the workout on its own. That sort of becomes a number, There's that saying, if a tree falls in a wood and no one sees it, did it actually happen? So it's like the same with a workout. If you did a workout, you don't tell anyone about it, you don't record it, did it happen? I feel sometimes a little bit like that. Thanks a lot for that, star. Stephanie says, I love writing in my planner organizer now. That's good to hear. Thought Criminal says, numbers hate me and I hate them. Okay, so guys, thanks very much for tuning in. I really didn't want to edit this together, so I thought I would just jump on and do a live. I think you'll agree with me that it's quite a fascinating subject. I want to follow this, and I don't think I'll do that as a live, but I want to follow it with what Brian's confession, which I think most of us don't believe, what it tells us likely did happen. And some of it is based on the words that he uses. And so the idea is, how does it bring us closer to finding out what really actually happened to Gabby? And so some of it's going to be quite general and quite obvious, but some of it I think will also be quite insightful. So look out for that. I don't know when that'll be. It might be Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. Tomorrow, Van Gogh letters. Stephanie, I hope you have a wonderful time at that trampoline park with celebrating your son's birthday. Daisy says, but there are additional confessions we have not yet seen. That's true. That's true. I don't know if we will see them. Stephanie says, what do you think about Brian also having an electronic letter? I'd like to see it. There's also the burn after reading letter that we don't quite know that exact, the contents of that exactly. Hopefully we will. Ashley Leith says, always love your lives. Thanks a lot, Ashley. Ollie. Okay. Okay, Daisy says, understand the numbers thing. I have to record everything, weights, reps, macros, just keep me on track. The thing is, when you record things with numbers, then you can also improve on those numbers, and over time, small incremental changes, amount to something. Big things have small beginnings. Oh, really? Jean Caro says Brian Enton is to release the digital one later tonight. I didn't know that. Has he not released it already? Let's have a look. "13 hours ago." Okay, it's not that one. Yeah, it's not quite out yet. Okay. Yeah, so I guess that's coming out later. So I guess we'll wait and see what that is. Something else that Brian Enton said was that there was a self signal at Spade Creek Camp. So to me, all of Brian's statements, like if anything had happened to Gabby, I mean, I never believed it to begin with, but if any of that was true, it would just be the simplest thing just to text for help or to call for help on using the phone, kind of thing. Thought Criminal says, I just want to get the date from it. Terry, okay. Jean Caro says, in an hour and a half, my time zone. Okay, so 90 minutes from now, let's check out what that is all about. We'll see. Okay, guys, thanks a lot for joining in. Mods, Sharon, Jean, Stephanie, thank you guys all for being here. And then also members, and I'll see you guys tomorrow for Van Gogh letters. And then thanks also to subs and new subscribers, and then also for all the super chats, especially your very nice super chat from Gathering Place. I hope you have better dreams than the previous one. Anne King says, bye, status quo, catch you next time. All the best, guys. See you next time. And Timmy also says goodbye. He's trying to keep warm. Shame. Bye, Timmy. Let's just have a look at this last comment here. Ashley Leith says, I was late, but on WFLA, Brian Enton said, well, you need to watch my video about that. I put a video up about that. Bria as well. I was looking for you, Bria. Thanks also for being here. Ashley, if you want to, let me just quickly put a link to that so you can check it out. But I did put up a video about the burn after reading thing. Let's just get the link. Timmy, I'm going to put you down. Let's just get the link here, and then that is it. Ashley, this is for you. I hope this answers your question. Yeah, there are quite a few of you still in chat, but that's my show for today. Okay, guys, all the best. Take care, and I'll see you guys next time. Ciao.